Hi everyone, welcome to today's webinar on how to sponsor professionals for your healthcare business. I'm really excited to have you here and just pass on some information for you. There will be a publication that you can download and I'll talk to you more about that. So just to introduce myself, my name is Chiew. I'm the practice leader in the corporate immigration team, and today we have a wonderful guest speaker, Derek Irwin, who is the Managing Director of GPR. And Derek, you might want to just quickly introduce yourself.
Yeah, so 20 years experience in recruiting international healthcare professionals into Australia. So delighted to be here in association with LegalVision, and back to Ian.
Oh, it's lovely to have you here, Derek. We're very honoured indeed. So before we begin the webinar, you will be emailed a copy of the webinar recording. And during this webinar or later on, you can submit your questions in the chat box. And we would really appreciate it if you could complete the survey after the completion of the webinar. So we're just going to go through an overview of what I will be discussing today, and obviously there'll be a concentration on healthcare professional occupations, and then what are just typically generally the AHPRA and skills assessment requirements. We will be talking about the employer-sponsored visas, and then Derek will take over and talk about, what are the issues in the market, how you're sourcing talent globally. Then we'll do a sort of a bit of a deeper dive into this temporary sponsored work visas, which is the 482 and the 494, and then your company specific labour agreements and DAMAs as well. And there'll be a time for questions and answers. So just an overview of our healthcare professionals, which doesn't seem to be up at the moment, but if I could talk you through, oh, thank you. You can put them all up. Thanks so much. So when you're talking about healthcare businesses, it can be anything: hospitals, allied health, medical centres, a range of different health facilities. And you may be considering needing to sponsor workers such as general practitioners, medical practitioners, specialist medical practitioners, nurses as well, and your full gamut of allied health professionals. But we will also talk about carers as well. And just to give you a bit of an overview, with the temporary employer-sponsored work visas and then subsequent permanent residency, typically you can sponsor all these occupations. So just a really brief summary of what the AHPRA registration requirements are and what the skills assessment requirements are, if they are needed for a particular visa. Now, usually registration is always required. What is really important to note that with general practitioners and medical practitioners, the AHPRA registration is also the skills assessment. But for some of the other occupations, they will need to apply and obtain a separate skills assessment to the AHPRA registration as well. So it really depends on the occupation and obviously the type of visa that you want to sponsor them on. So I'm going to hand it over to Derek now, who will sort of talk to you about, what's happening in the market at the moment, why there's a huge demand, and some of tips, tools, and tricks that you can use to try and source global talents.
Thank you, Ian. So really, I always ask myself, why are we doing this webinar today? And it's really because there is a shortage, a serious shortage in the healthcare professionals across Australia. Some of the stats here are estimated shortages of 100,000 nurses, and I'm using nursing as an example, 123,000 by 2030. The sector is rapidly growing, and as we all know, it's among Australia's largest. We've got an aging population like most Western countries, and it's impacting the ability to stay in the workforce. The key point on this slide for me, though, is that 21% of new nurses are skilled migrants. So when we bear in mind over the past 2 to 3 years, impact by COVID and border closures, we can only imagine what this impact will have moving forward in the shortages of the nursing profession and other healthcare professions. So this is something to watch closely moving forward. Pre-COVID, the shortage was in regional locations, but now we're seeing post-COVID that it's both regional and metro areas where we have a high demand and a shortage. So we've got even a broader demand for healthcare professionals. So on this slide, I'm going to step through it with what we need to do as organizations. We need to be prepared. We need to include a plan of cultural integration. It has to come from the top as well. It has to be seen as a strategy, a workforce strategy, not as we must do it because we're short. We need to be able to, create a 12-month training plan to educate and support international hires. We obviously need to have career plans for professional development. Key point here is this preceptor buddy system in place, where the healthcare professional has that individual that they can work with and go to if they've got day-to-day challenges or problems. We also need not to look at only as a job, but also as a holistical approach to the whole thing. So providing local religious and cultural advice for successful community integration is key to that, especially when they have children for schools and so on and so on. And also we must look at having short-term accommodation identified for the smooth transition. So the self-reflection here for organizations is, and when I say self-reflection is person in the mirror, we need to look in the mirror and we need to ask ourselves, do we have a culture that's welcoming for international hires? Going back to that whole thing of being a workforce strategy rather than, oh, we have to do it. Do we have our job expectations in place? Have we got the educational resources that explain their role, performance, and responsibilities? We want these people to integrate quickly and contribute quickly, and they also want to do it as well. So we need to have a strategic onboarding geared towards role clarity and talent nurturing. Every country has got their different regulatory requirements, so it's important that we explain clearly what the Australian regulatory healthcare compliance requirements are. Key point here in this slide is visa. The benefits of these visas that Yin is going to speak about later is that it provides you with a healthcare professional for 4 to 5 years. So that's 4 to 5 years providing a sustainable workforce and long-term continuity of care for your patients, for your clients. So global competition, why should these international professionals choose Australia? Let's look at some of the stats out there at the moment. UK, USA, Canada, we're all competing for this talent. It's a talent war. Recently, 2021, the UK reported that there was 39 vacant nursing jobs, for example, in England. I suspect that's doubled in 2022. In the US, 1.2 million new registered nurses needed by 2030. Canada, most recently in 2022, this year, have estimated 60,000 nurses required. So in Australia, we need to keep ahead of the pack and make sure that we have all our processes and procedures in place to welcome these international hires once we can find them, obviously, and once we can recruit them. I'm going to hand you back to Yin now, where she's going to step through the different types of visa that will help us achieve this. Thank you.
Thank you, Derek. So the first is discussing the temporary employer-sponsored visas, which is the subclass 482 and the 494. Typically, a business first needs to be an approved business sponsor, and then you can potentially sponsor these workers in the occupations that we have outlined in the previous slide in either of these visa subclasses. The 482 is essentially a replacement of the 457 visa and allows for you to sponsor the healthcare professional workers occupations outlined in the previous slide if the position is based pretty much anywhere in Australia. But the 494 visa is a regional employer-sponsored visa. So the position and the employer must be based in a designated regional area. They are a three-stage application, meaning that once the sponsorship is approved, it's approved for 5 years. You don't really have to do that step again unless you want to apply for accreditation. And then for each employee, sponsored worker, you're looking at a nomination and visa application. The situation is different if the applicant or candidate that you want to sponsor is already on shore on a 482 or 494 visa. In that respect, you only really need to do the nomination application to transfer them over to the business that's already an approved business sponsor. But this chart just typically explains the stages, the steps, and what you should be considering here. Now, obviously, each application will have specific requirements to meet. We don't go into a great amount of detail about that, but that is in our publication. I just wanted to give you a brief understanding of the key differences between the 482 and the 494. And one of them I specifically touched on is where is the position located? So with the 482, it can be anywhere in Australia, but with the 494, it must be in a designated regional area. And it's quite broad what that actually means. And in practice, it's anywhere that's not Sydney, Melbourne, and Brisbane. Each visa will have its own occupation list that you can elect from, but the majority of the healthcare and medical worker occupations that I've outlined above will be contained in either of these visas. The work experience requirement is also different. So with the 482, it's 2 years of work experience. With the 494, it's 3 years. With the 494, skills assessment is mandatory. But with the 482, there is no mandatory skills assessment, particularly for the occupations that we have reviewed previously. English requirements are also a little bit different too, and then the duration of the visa is different. With the 482, the max period would be 4 years, but depending on a few variables, such as if an international trade agreement applies. But with the 494, it's valid for 5 years. And typically from these two visas, there will be sort of independent pathways to permanent residency, depending again on the occupation. So company-specific labour agreements. If you sort of recall the chart that I gave you before that said sponsorship, nomination, and visa application, a company-specific labour agreement essentially replaces the sponsorship approval layer. And it is really useful if the occupation that you want to nominate is not on the 482 occupation list or the 494 occupation list. This is typically the case with carers. So if you're wanting to actually sponsor carers, and let's just move on to the other slide to explain that a little bit further. This is sort of an expansion of the table that we had with the 482. With a company-specific labour agreement, you are utilising the 482 or the 494 visa pathway. It's just that you have a company-specific labour agreement approval in place instead of the standard business sponsorship. And under that company-specific labour agreement, there may be certain concessions, there may be certain terms, particularly pertaining to the applicant's skills, English, age, that may be different from the 482 or 494 traditional pathway. So coming back to this occupation of carers, and there's a few different categories, however you want to name them, aged or disability carer. These occupations are not typically on the 482 or the 494 visa list. Actually, there's about 2 of these occupations that are on the 494 visa. So it is possible to sponsor them under the traditional pathway for 494 if the position is located in a regional area. But if it's not, then you're looking at a company-specific labour agreement. And this is where you can access either the 482, the 494, and there will be pathways to permanent residency after a period of time via the 186. This is what you negotiate with the Department of Home Affairs via this company-specific labour agreement. So just a recap of what kind of concessions you could negotiate or get under the company-specific labour agreement for the occupation of carers. One of them, as I said, being permanent residency pathways, typically available after 3 years of being with the employer, sponsored on a 482 or 494 visa. And then there are age concessions as well. So the applicant can be up to 55 as opposed to the normal 45 age, which is the requirement under a 186. So a pathway from a 482 to a 186. There's lower English language proficiency. The actual educational qualifications can be a little bit lower. They're more at a skill level 4. So most occupations on the 482 visa and on the 494 visa are skill level 1 or 2. But for the company-specific labour agreement and for this occupation of carer, they can be a skill level 4. And obviously some relevant experience such as on-the-job training will be considered as well. Another labour agreement is called the Designated Area Migration Agreements, and there are 7 of them. And it all depends on the specific territory that the business is based in, the occupation will be located in, and these different regional areas, they have negotiated these DAMAs with the Australian government. It's essentially a 2-stage process where you sort of submit a registration of interest to the relevant regional body, and then you submit this DAMA labour agreement. And it effectively does the same thing or is the same process as your standard business sponsorship, company-specific labour agreement, in that it replaces that in overarching approval. And then you can sponsor workers on either a 482 or 494 visa with pathway to permanent residency, so from the 482 to the 186. Now, these regional locations actually have their own occupation list as well, and they will be either expansive or restrictive or just different to the 482 occupation list and the 494 occupation list. They may combine a few things, and usually these occupations are sort of designed in conjunction with community stakeholders. But typically the healthcare professional occupations outlined above will be included in the majority, if not all, of these DAMAs as well. And the great news with some of these DAMAs, they are all different, but they offer things like age concessions as well. Some of them offer age concessions up to 50, maybe 55. Again, lower English requirements, just sort of things that can make it a little bit more fluid and easier for your business to sponsor if you're based in one of these regional areas as well. I think the next slide is sort of another table, if we could have a look at that. Yeah, so this is sort of the table again where the DAMA will be in place instead of the company-specific labour agreement or the standard business sponsorship, but you're still utilising the same visa subclasses, but you have a specific arrangement already in place that negotiates certain aspects or certain criteria of the 482 or the 494 visa. But there's still a requirement to lodge the nomination, the associate nomination, and then the visa application for each sponsored worker. And then we sort of gave you a little pathway there that under the DAMA, under the company-specific labour agreement, there is pathway to permanent residency from the 482 to the 186. So if we were to consider the sponsorship under the standard business sponsorship, okay, most of the occupations on the first slide, you can sponsor on a 482, on a 494, and then there'll be pathways to permanent residency, except for enrolled nurses and except for carers. So for enrolled nurses and carers, you may be looking at either a 494 if the position is based in a regional location, or you may have to consider a company-specific labour agreement that allows permanent residency pathways, or the DAMA. So there are actually quite a few options available to your healthcare business. But obviously it really depends on your needs, the occupation, where the position is located, and then having that sort of initial assessment to outline the most appropriate, cost-effective pathway for the business. But also more importantly, most beneficial pathway for the business. So I think for carers, for instance, I get a lot of these questions where, you know, they accessing a DAMA or a company-specific labour agreement to sponsor this occupation gives them access to a wider cohort, a wider candidate cohort up to a certain age where that would not be traditionally available for them. So there's a lot of benefits to DAMAs and the company-specific labour agreement as well. And I'm wondering, Derek, if you wanted to sort of, express some of your input, your experience with working with company-specific labour agreements, DAMAs, with some of your clients as well.
Yeah, look, it's interesting. There's a lot of information there, Ian. So I'm guessing that you're going to get a lot of questions. So having a labour agreement such as DAMA, for example, I'm working with a company at the moment where they're working towards their DAMA, and they see the huge benefits in regional locations. And you mentioned about the age profile, that it allows skilled professionals over the age of 45. That's a great advantage, because what you're getting there is getting people with more experience, with more healthcare experience in all their professions. So that particular labour agreement is a fantastic conduit for a more highly skilled network of people to come into that catchment area. So yeah, it's having a labour agreement, certainly. I probably would see it as a kind of an umbrella arrangement, where the department already give you a tick of the box saying that yes, you've been approved as from a compliant perspective. So the process actually flows faster, and the lodgement goes smoother, and the business gets done quicker. So the return on investment for the client over time is vastly improved by having those labour agreements in place.
Absolutely, and that is exactly correct, that for those businesses, employers that do access the company-specific labour agreement or DAMA, their associated nominations and visa applications for their sponsored workers, they are priority processed as well. So thank you so much, Derek, for your comments and feedback around that and your experience. So please download our employer guide to sponsoring foreign workers. It actually goes into quite a lot of detail about the specific requirements for each application stage, and it will sort of expand upon the labour agreements and the DAMAs as well. That's free to download. So we have time for questions, and I just going through the questions now. Yes. So the first question is, I have a remedial massage therapist who is originally from Thailand on a temporary COVID work visa. And I'd like to sponsor this person, but she has researched and believes Victoria doesn't allow this. Is that the case? The short answer to that is no, that's not the case, because with employer-sponsored work visas, as I said, if it's on a 482 visa and remedial massage therapist, well, it's actually called massage therapist, is on the 482 visa list, and it's also on the 494 occupation list. This may be referring to potentially a state-nominated application, which we're not covering in this webinar, but with employer-sponsored visas, it's definitely, it can be anywhere. And with a 494, it can be in a designated regional area. There is a caveat for massage therapists in relation to a 482 visa, and that is that they need to work in a therapeutic environment. So most massage therapists will work in a sort of health clinic with other allied health professionals. So they'll be working as a multidisciplinary team to provide this holistic, overarching care for the patient. And that's what the department defines as a therapeutic environment. The next question is, with the current Section 48 bar lifted, allowing applicants to apply for the 494, would a protection visa applicant who has been refused by the department and awaiting review be able to apply for this, assuming they meet the skilled requirements and have a sponsor? There's a lot of issues with this question, and I can't give a complete answer, but generally, yes. Next question is, you mentioned additional requirements for physio and some other allied health disciplines. Are there specific requirements for psychologists and speech pathologists? So again, it depends on the visa. It depends whether it's under a standard business sponsorship approval or under a company specific labor agreement or DAMA. And basically, the skills requirement for those occupations are that they either need 2 to 3 years of work experience, they may need a skills assessment, and they will need AHPRA registration as well. Just going through the... Great. So doesn't seem to be any further questions. So just reminding everyone that there is an employer guide to sponsoring foreign workers, and that please go ahead and download it. And obviously then if you wanted to contact Derek, who's the Managing Director of GPR, please do so. There's his contact details. Derek, did you want to add anything to that?
No, that's all good. I'd be delighted to speak to individuals if they wish to speak to me about their requirements, and we can certainly look at that and help them out. Happy to do that. Thank you.
Absolutely. And similarly with LegalVision as well, if you kind of need to know a little bit more about each pathway, want to sort of discuss a potential strategy, happy to have a discussion with you about it. So at this time, I just wanted to tell you about LVConnect Pro membership, which provides you all the legal assistance that you need at an affordable price, and it includes a number of things such as unlimited document and drafting review, unlimited legal advice consultations, obviously legal support across Australia and New Zealand, company incorporation, all those sorts of things. And anyone who attends this webinar is eligible to receive a complimentary consultation to discuss how LVConnect Pro can help your business, and you can then redeem this special offer. And obviously, if you aren't satisfied with membership in the first 30 days, you can cancel your membership and there's no questions asked as well. So you can book a strategy session and redeem your special offer. You just need to click yes in the survey, and then you can, or you can send an email to reply@legalvision.com.au, mention that you watched this webinar as well. So thank you very much, everyone, for your time. It was a pleasure to sort of present this to you. Derek, thank you so much for joining us today, and I hope everyone got some good information out of it. So have a wonderful day, everyone. Talk to you soon.